exciting for me. So I've been over the last week trying to figure out how to implement a Dagger interface in PowerShell. I'm not going to call it an SDK at the moment, but just seeing how I can basically wrap my head around this. So let me share this. Okay, so first, if you'll bear with me, I'm just going to do a quick little demo of PowerShell for people who aren't familiar. Like a typical shell, it's got a REPL, but the big difference is you have full access to the .NET type system. So simply declaring some stuff, a version, now it's smart enough to know how to compare version strings without having to do like jQuery and split things apart and look at all the parts. So that it's a fairly common practice, I guess, if you're working in like a PowerShell module or any kind of complicated PowerShell code, you typically will just go into C# and start writing stuff because PowerShell is, at the end of the day, it's still a shell language and doesn't have the full features of like C#. Fortunately, I found a couple of projects that really help bootstrap this effort. There's this GraphQL client generator, which you just point it at a GraphQL schema, and it spits out a bunch of C# for you. It's literally like a ton of C#, which was kind of step one. So that gives me that nice .NET type system to work with. But it's not super useful or user-friendly. Where is it? Like this is an example of if you could do it in C# using kind of their Fluent syntax. Unfortunately, it's not quite that user-friendly if you try and convert this to PowerShell. So I started writing some stuff. Let's see, that one. Just a really simple wrapper script that is wrapping those generated types and giving you a nice little kind of PowerShell friendly interface. So what does that look like? Well, I guess let me show you. Well, let me do this. So first thing, I'm packaging up this as a PowerShell module. So if you were using this as a consumer, you could, download this from the public PowerShell gallery. You can run it from localhost. And now I have essentially these have this module with these exported commands, which let me create something that looks like the schema. So my little sample application here, this little get weather commandlet. I'm just building up a really simple, what you'd call it, the DAG basically. Looks a lot like the GraphQL, and let's see what that looks like. So if I run this, it expands itself out, and you get just a graph query object, which is okay. It's not super great, but I could also call the build method on it, and there you get your nice stringified representation. Or if you want a pretty version, you can print it indented, which is nice. But then if you want to actually, get something back, I can pass it to my invoke Dagger query, which is just sending out the REST call to the Dagger engine. Same problem. It sits there and looks like it's doing nothing. because we're just hiding the output. Hopefully it's doing something. There we go. So I got some stuff back, but I forgot to save it. So let me save that as a variable and then we can look at it. So now I've got, I typoed it, so now it's date. So now I've got, again, an object representation of my response from Dagger container. Let's see, that standard out contents, I think. Nope, I missed something.
It's a typo and standard out.
Thank you.
Yeah.
There you go. But still, I typed something else. All right. Oh my God, I can't type. All right, well, let's cheat. Let's just go back to.
That's how we know the demo is real.
Yep. Do I have the data? No, I don't. Okay, it's in here somewhere. But what I can also do is I do capture the output as well. So go back and see. It looks like it did everything. I don't know if my command actually works. So, no, yesterday, WTTR, water, weather, whatever, was throwing some 500 errors. And so maybe it was a bad choice for a demo. But kind of where I've got to right now, it's not, again, I hand wrote all of this. I do have the beginnings of code generator, which will spit out functions for all the fields. Just still trying to figure out really what's the best way to make this into a usable thing, because PowerShell, obviously it's a shell, so there's kind of a interactive component. I'm not sure if anybody would do this, but maybe they would actually like to sit here and just say, like, get me a container. Okay, now let me pipe this to something else and see what I get. So you can build that up incrementally versus trying to build it all out as a program. But then you can also just write programs and write modules, same as any other language.
I just want to say we're saying it in the chat, but just so you know, we're A, super impressed, and B, very happy that you showed up and started building something like this so early. We didn't plan for it, which is why the tools are a little rough. But you know, would love to add polish, and if there's some areas that were more painful than others, or confusing, just let us know, and I guess we'll polish that first.
Yeah, well, I mean, the biggest problem really is, like, again, this is, I guess there's the choice of either going with this generated, C# list of classes, which is great, but there's nothing documented, right? I have no idea what any of these do. I have to like go look through and find out, what does this actually map to? How do I use it? What other type does it actually depend on or help?
Oh, on the GraphQL side.
Well, on the C# side.
Oh,
right?
I see.
Like you go to the GraphQL representation, like that's fairly easy to follow. But when you start looking at the C#, it's like, okay, I have this query builder, which I have to pass these query parameters, and like, you start getting into a typical type system where it's just, it's a lot more complicated than maybe you would need for PowerShell. Like I could just spit out a bunch of strings and it'd be perfectly fine. You lose the strong typing, but
yeah,
I don't know.
For context, for everyone watching, wondering where this fits in the overall stack, just a super quick summary. You've got the Dagger engine at the bottom that actually runs the pipelines. on top of containers, and that's the same for everyone. And then we have these SDKs, right, where you write code in your favorite language, and there's an API to control that engine. And so Nick was showing the Go version, Heller was showing the Python version, Tanguy was showing the Node.js version. But all those SDKs are actually generated, and they're generated clients targeting an API, which is the only real API for Dagger, and it's a GraphQL API. And we haven't launched that yet, but it's there. We're going to launch docs for it, etc. And so once we launch that, there will be a new official way to use the Dagger engine, which is to write a GraphQL client directly without using the generated SDKs. And that will be a great way to, for example, program Dagger using in a language that does not yet have an official SDK, right? The big difference is that when you do it that way, the GraphQL part is visible. And so that's, if anyone's wondering why there's GraphQL looking things in Chris's examples, that's why, because he's writing an actual GraphQL client.
Right, and that's what makes it
generate that client so that you can actually make those GraphQL queries without knowing you're making them, because someone generated a nice native client for you. And that's what Chris is doing as an additional layer on top, but it's just, that's the hardest part right now.
Yeah, but then using GraphQL, I was able to use these, like, this builder, and then there's already a PowerShell client for sending GraphQL queries and serializing the response. So yeah, there's a lot of work to like translate the structure, I guess, of the Dagger schema, but there's also plenty of stuff to work on top of.
I have a question, Chris, because you mentioned that PowerShell and .NET are related. I mean, but I'm not completely familiar with how related they are. I mean, I know what C#.NET is, I know what PowerShell is, but how much of your work could be reused for a C# as SDK or client?
Yeah. So this is how related PowerShell is to .NET. The system management automation library is the PowerShell engine. So you can actually reference that in any .NET application, and you have full access to the runtime, the parser, and all that. Then PowerShell itself builds, it exposes all the type, the .NET types, but it builds a dynamic type system on top of it. So you can pull stuff from like C# and .NET, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to go back. If you add things on top of it, it might not translate. But for the most part, like I said, if you start from the beginning thinking about, I could build this as a .NET client first, and then expose those classes and methods in PowerShell. That's really, that's what this is doing. This syntax, the square brackets, is just saying I need this type, new it up, and then I can start calling methods on it. So this is the same namespace and type that I would use to reference. If you go all the way to the top of this, so there's a namespace, and then these are the types. So there's a one-to-one mapping there. So yeah, if you think about it ahead of time and build it from a C# first perspective, you basically get 2 for 1.
Yeah, I'm asking because I saw several people ask specifically for C#. Definitely there's some people out there who want to do .NET CI/CD.
Yeah, I asked around my coworkers, and nobody was really interested in doing C#. I think you could definitely still do some pretty interesting things, especially .NET has a way of packaging up binaries as a tool that you can download through the same NuGet feeds. So you can publish essentially a library and an executable kind of side by side. They're just, one has a executable interface and one's just a library interface. But you could package up like a C# build tool that anybody could download and kind of use as a starting place.
Very cool.
Chris, was that when you say that people didn't necessarily want to build their pipelines in C# that you talked to it, but was that what they would rather do, is have like a binary that they could use as a helper, or did they talk about PowerShell or talk about a different language?
No, I think it was from the perspective of, I want to stick with the tools that I have, which I think is perfectly acceptable if all you're doing is local builds. But as soon as you're trying to do any kind of build that goes, to CI or runs on somebody's machine, or so you want to spin up a bunch of services, run some integration tests on your local machine, that gets pretty difficult to do if you're just like defining these in CS proj or whatever files. So I think that was just a bit of, right now, the developers I talk to have a pretty easy life where they can just like hit F5 and build it, and then they say yay, and they pushed it, and it magically gets built in the cloud, and they don't think about it. But as they get more and more responsibility for the whole thing, the whole CI/CD process, I think their opinion might change a bit.
Got it. That's the experience from like Visual Studio Code with C# project and .NET project. You just hit the F5 and kicks off the old build and etc. That kind of a integrated experience, what they're used to. Yeah,
and again, like you probably don't follow Stack Overflow technology, but it's a monolith. It is slow to build on a good day. So adding any kind of overhead, typically makes things worse.
Meaning that people like to build locally as much as they can.
They like to build locally, and they like to build it in like, bare metal.
Yeah.
And again, like Docker works great, but there is a downside of anytime you're mounting files into Docker, which runs in WSL, the virtualization can make things quite painful. Stop.
Well, you mentioned at the beginning, Chris, that it's just interesting to you, but I think all of us are really excited about that demo. So it was a big deal. So thank you. And it's obviously a lot of work going into this. So I'm excited to see this keep moving forward.